Hello class, this is Professor Quigley and it is week 7. We are going to learn about functions this week and I know it could be a little difficult, but just know we're going to take a couple weeks talking about them. This is going to be the last major programming thing that we're going to learn in this class. Now last week we talked about arrays where we could save time not declaring so many different variables and just declare one variable and store a bunch of values into it. This week, functions, though it's not quite the same thing, we're not creating a variable that holds data, we are creating a function that does something. But it's going to save us time in the fact that we're not going to have to write the same lines of code over and over and over again. So if there are several lines of code that you know you're going to have to do multiple different times in your application, you can just write it into a function once. So if you have 100 lines of code, if you needed to do that operation twice, why write 200 lines of code? If you need to do it 300 times, that means you'd have to write 300 lines of code. You're writing the same 100 lines of code over and over and over. That's a waste of time. What we want to do is write one function that does one thing and allow people to just call that function whenever we need those lines of code to execute. I'm going to show you. All right, so as I mentioned, a function is very useful. So imagine if you were writing a fighting video game and you want it to be that every time the user hits the B button, your character would just throw an uppercut. You don't know how often that user is going to hit the B button in your video game to essentially throw the uppercut. However, you do know that every time that action occurs, you want that function to execute. So it's very important that we learn this week because a function allows us to group lines of code together and call those lines of code anytime we want. The best way for me to articulate this is just to show you an example. Now, in all of my code examples that I've shown you throughout the weeks, we've had a function up here. I just never described to you what it is. So over here, you can see we have a main function. Every time this program starts, it's going to look for that main function and do what I have written in here. So I'm going to go ahead and run this application. This application is going to start up, and the only thing it does is print to the screen, hello world. Now, I am going to create a function that does that for me. I am going to say static, I'm going to say void, I'll explain what this means in a minute, and then I'm going to create a function that's going to call output message. And what I'm going to do inside that function, I am going to take this line of code that we had here, and I'm going to cut it and put it here. Now, the application's still going to start here within this main function, but what I'm going to do is write a line of code that simply says, do this. So I'm going to write output message, and then I'm going to do this open and close parentheses. I'll actually explain to you what those are used for here in a second, but just know that my application is still going to do the same thing I just did. It looks a little different. So you see, notice right here how it's still outputted to the screen, hello world. And let me X out of this and drop a breakpoint. So when I drop a breakpoint here, I'm going to run this application. We're going to see that it's going to start here in this main function. So I'm going to hit F11. It's going to go to this function. And notice how it highlighted this function over here. So Visual Studio is nice enough to say, hey, I'm about to do this and I'm about to jump right here. So as I hit F11, it jumps over here inside this function and it goes to this line of code. And then it goes back here and continues off and finishes in this main loop. And then if I were to open up this program, I could see it did just that. So if I were to take this line of code and copy it 3 times, I can have it do that 3 times. So now notice how when I hit F11, it goes over to here, it jumps down to here, and it writes on the screen hello world. Then it goes back up to the main loop where it started. It goes back to line 10. But line 10, I'm telling it to call that function again. So it goes down here, does that same line of code a second time. Hit F11. Now I go back to the 3rd line. It's going to call that function again, execute that same line of code a 3rd time. Now it finishes what it was doing, closes the application, and if I open this up, I can see I have hello world written to the screen 3 times. So essentially, because of functions, I was able to make it to where this one single line of code got executed 3 times. Now you might be thinking, Professor Quigley, like, what's the difference between me writing 3 lines of code here versus me just taking this line of code and just doing it like this? I know it seems like it's the same thing, but what if this method output text message had like 50 lines of code in it? I could still start those 50 lines of code by this one line of code, thus I'd be saving. Something else I want to show you here. You can actually specify parameters and arguments, basically some values that you could pass into a function. So I can say string, this is the data type that it's going to accept into the function, and I'm going to call this variable message. Now, what I can do is rather than output in a fixed string here, I can say, I'm going to type message. And so when I click message, you see how it's highlighted right here? This basically means it's going to write to the screen whatever was passed into here. Now I'm getting a red squiggly line over here in Visual Studio, and this is because this function is looking at this and realizing, hey, wait a second. If you're going to call this function, you have to pass in the message. So this right here is what we call a function signature, which basically means anytime you call this function, you have to pass in a string variable, and I'm going to do that right now. So I don't have to write string message because this is where I'm calling it. So this tells me what I need to pass in. Over here, I just need to do it. So all I have to do is pass in a string. So I'm going to type in hello world. Now, I am going to do that here 3 times, but I'm going to type in different values. So I'm going to say hello world, my name is David. Then I'm going to type in I love CIS 110. Now, this function is dynamic because it's going to accept a string value, and then over here the function is going to output whatever it was that was passed in here. So I'm going to keep, actually I'll remove my breakpoint, play this application here, and so when I run it, it did just that. Hello world, my name is David, I love CIS 110. So if I were to step through that so we can see how the computer thinks and how it executes through this sequence here. So I'm going to hit F11. So it's going into my main loop first, and it's getting ready to call this function down here. Because this function says I need to pass a string in there, I'm going to hit F11, and it's going to do that. Now, if I mouse over here, this variable message, I can see that value equals hello world, because that's what was passed in. So now when I mouse over message, there's the hello world value, and it's going to get outputted. Now I go to this next line of code within the main. Now I'm calling the output message again, but this time I'm passing in a string that says my name is David. So when I do that, now that the computer has entered into this function, if I mouse over this message, I can see that this right here, this line of code passed in my name is David. So I keep going, and it keeps going, and then eventually I have those 3 values outputted on the screen. But let's not stop there. Let's actually take a more advanced dive. Remember that application that we built previously, our area calculator? So I'll go ahead and run this application so you can remember what it was that we built. So see how it says, what is the length of this room? I typed in 100. What is the width of the room? I type in 200. Wow, that is a big room. The area of that room is 20,000 square feet. Do you want to measure another room? Yes or no? I'm going to hit no, and then my program ends. Now, this program starts off here in this main function. If I were to collapse it, here's where you can see it. So everything happens within the main. So what I'm going to do down here is I'm going to create another function, and I'm going to call this static void. Actually, let me think this through real quick. Rather than void, so void is basically what's going to get returned. So in my previous example, it meant void because all it's doing is outputting something to the screen. It's not returning anything. I'm actually going to return something now. I'm going to return an integer. and this is going to be called calculate area. This function, I'm going to require you to pass in an integer, which will be your length. And then I'm also going to require you to pass in an integer called width. Now, the reason why Visual Studio is putting a red line under here is because I said that this function is going to return an integer. And right now it's looking at my code block and it's saying, you said you're going to return something, but you haven't returned anything. So I am going to declare a variable, and this is going to be called result. Did I type that wrong? Declare int. Oh wait, sorry. I'm thinking Zybooks. You don't actually write declare when you're in a real code editor. So I'm going to say declare int equals 0. And now I'm going to say result equals, and we'll do length times width. Now my red line is going to go away because I'm going to say return, and I'm going to return the result. All right. So here I've declared a function called calculate area. It's going to accept two integer values. And if I were to look at the signature, it's knowing that, hey, the first integer you give me, that needs to be the length. The second one needs to give me the width. Then what I'm going to do inside that function, I'm going to declare a variable that I need called result. And I'm going to set the result to equal the length. So see how when I select this, this is going to be the value here of whatever's passed into the first one. This is going to be the value of whatever's passed in the second time. And then I am going to return that result back to whichever it was that called it. Now notice right here Visual Studio says 0 references. Again, I'm showing you this in Visual Studio because it's easier for me to explain than doing this in the Zybooks. I'm hoping that even though you're not going to be writing this code, I'm hoping that like I can kind of explain to you how the computer thinks, and then that way when you approach your Zybooks activities, this will make sense. You notice right here how it says 0 references. That's because nowhere in my code up here do I actually call this function. I'm about to change that. So calculate area. So let's find out where I actually calculate the area. I do it right here. So let's actually do it like this. So I'm going to say calculate area. And remember, if I look down here, it tells me I need to pass in the length and the width. Now, I don't have to actually pass in variables that have the same name, because remember, I could type in 1, 2, and that's going to work. I have no red squiggly lines, because as far as I'm concerned, that's an integer. So I could pass in a 1 and a 2, and then when this function works, this will be a 1, and this will be a 2, because order matters here. If I were to pass it in like this, then the 2 is going to get assigned to whatever I have in that first spot there. But we're going to do calculate area, and I'm going to type in length, and then over here this is going to be width. So now when I run this program, I'm going to drop a breakpoint right here, so that way you can see how this could, actually I'll do it right over here. So take that back. We'll do it right up here on line 10. Line 8. All right, so I'm going to hit play on this application. There were build errors. Would you like to continue? No, let's see what my build errors were. Use of unassigned local variable area. So I didn't declare area anymore. So let's go ahead, int area. What do I want to do here? All right, I'll just do int area. Oh, I'm sorry. I totally forgot. Remember how over here at the function, I said this function is going to return an integer, and here is where I declared result. It's an integer, and it's going to return that. Since this function is actually returning a value, I'm actually going to say area equals whatever the result of this function is. So let's drop that breakpoint here on 8. I'm going to hit play. Now, application starts. I hit F11. I declared int width area. I'm going to hit F11. I'm going to keep going. Int I equals 1. I don't remember why I did that. Oh, let's see. While keep going equals yes. So that's our basic while loop. Here's our condition. Keep going equals yes. So we're going to keep going. Console write line, what is the length of the room? I'm going to take that and type in 20. It took that, stored it into length. Now it's going to say what is the width of the room. Whatever I type in here, it's going to store it into width. I'm going to say 10, and I click enter. Now, here's the magic that I wanted to show you. See how it says area equals calculate area length times width? So if I mouse over length, it's 20, because that's what was stored here that I typed in. Width is 10, because that's what I typed in after it asked me what is the width of the room. Area still has 0. But because I declared a function, previously when we learned sequence, it was going line 25, line 26, line 27, line 28. But we declared a function. So in line 27, it's going to jump to wherever that function actually is. So when I hit F11, now it jumped way down here to this new function we just created. So what was passed in for the length and width was 20 and 10. So inside this function, I'm declaring an integer called result, so that way I have something to return back. Result is going to equal length times width, which is 20 times 10. So my result now equals 200. I'm going to return that. So when I return that, I click F11. It goes all the way back up to the line that called it. So when I click F11, now I can see area equals 200. Because this was a function. So if you imagine for a second that I needed to calculate the area 100 different times, all I would have to do is call that function. So if I were to keep going and if I were to continue this application, I would still get, wow, that is a big room. The area of the room is 200 square feet. So that, I know it was kind of long. I know there's a lot of stuff that I didn't even cover. Many of this I'm going to bring up in the discussion threads. However, please reach out to me this week if none of this is making sense. I know I was talking real fast because if I'm not careful, this will be a 30, 45-minute video. Reach out to me if there's something I said that doesn't make sense, but read through the participation activities very slowly. I promise you, if you do that, you will get this. Remember, this is the last thing that we're going to learn in this class that is difficult. So buckle down. Work hard, and I promise you, we're going to get through this together, and then you're going to say you passed one of the hardest classes you're ever going to take. So reach out to me. Thank you. Take care. Look forward to seeing you in the discussion threads.